Well, hello. I'm Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, and I am delighted to welcome you to the National Book Festival. I want to give a shout out, of course, to the audience right here at the Convention Center, as well as all of the people who are joining us virtually from around the country and around the world. And I want to give a special thanks to the James Madison Council. They're the library's private sector support group for sponsoring this stage and also being such supporters of the festival in general. So please join me in thanking them. Now, each year at the National Book Festival, I get to do something really wonderful. I get to confer the library's prize for American fiction. And the prize honors an American literary writer whose body of work is distinguished not only for its mastery of the art, but also for its originality of thought and imagination. The award seeks to commend strong, unique, enduring voices that throughout consistently accomplished careers have told us something essential about the American experience. Previous winners of the prize include Toni Morrison, Philip Roth, Marilynne Robinson, Louise Erdrich, and last year, Jesmyn Ward. This year's winner, George Saunders, and you might as well clap right now. Is the New York Times best-selling author of 12 books, including his novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, which won the 2017 Man Booker Prize. We featured George in his nonfiction book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a master class on writing, reading, and life at the 2021 National Book Festival. And this year, we're happy to have him back to talk about his great and celebrated body of work. He's the recipient of many honors, including fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation and the Guggenheim Foundation, the PEN Prize for Excellence in the Short Story. George is a professor of creative writing at Syracuse University. So we are pleased to add to that list of honors the library's singular honor for fiction writing. So please, George, join me on the stage. I would like to confer this Crystal Award. It is heavy. And you could, look, we could put it here because what's going to happen now, congratulations, George, and I'm going to turn over the program to Clay Smith, the literary director of the Library of Congress, for our conversation with George Saunders.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations,
Thank you.
George.
I was going to set that in the middle in case I say anything stupid. I'll just kind of gesture at it.
Yeah, have the trophy speak for you. So it seems, appropriate to, well, let me first tell you that George and I are going to talk for a little bit, and then we will, of course, open it up to questions from you all. And if I know my George Saunders work and his fans, George Saunders fans always have questions, so we will get to your questions for sure. But sitting here in the heart of Washington, it seems appropriate to ask you about the sort of state of American democracy. And Lincoln in the Bardo obviously comes up as a reference point in your work. It is set in Oak Hill Cemetery, not too far from here. And one of the things that I admire about that novel is the sort of cacophony of voices. There are characters in the Bardo who sort of talk outdo one another. There are characters who talk past one another. There are characters who do not understand one another. It feels to me like democracy. It's messy. And I wondered if you were thinking about American democracy when you were writing that novel, or is that just me being a book critic who's reading too much into something that you did not intend?
No, I think that's really perceptive. I was first of all kind of struggling with a technical problem, which is you have this thing where Lincoln is in a graveyard by himself. Now you do 300 pages on that, and it's really hard. So I kept thinking, well, who else can be in this book? Graveyard night, ghosts. And then once they started talking, it's exactly as you said. They were. I had noticed in doing some political reporting this phenomenon where people will say blah blah blah, yes, but blah blah blah, and in fact they're not really talking at all. I got from a teacher of mine once. I got some advice on dialogue writing, and he said, we always think that when you talk, the other person is listening, and then responds logically. But in fact, what happens is when I'm talking to you, you've got a little cartoon bubble in your head that you're thinking about your childhood, or you're building up a grudge against me, and essentially what you're doing is you're preparing your response. So that means in every human communication, there's a little bit of that. Unless somebody's a really good listener. So it's a lot of fun when you're writing literary dialogue to remember that characters very rarely answer one another logically. And in making that mistake, they reveal a lot. So in that book, the format that I stumbled on, in addition to the ghosts, was to have these kind of standalone monologues, a lot of them. And in that, it was so much fun to let people talk past each other. Sometimes groups of 3 and 4 were firing cells. And the one beautiful thing that happened in that book that relates to your question about democracy is I write without really knowing where the thing is headed. That's kind of the fun of it for me. In that book, this weird thing happened, which was, I would describe it as viral goodness. So there's all these ghosts who've been there over at Oak Hill a long time, and they can't get out of there. They don't like it. They don't really like each other. All they want to do is tell their own story. So you get the sense it's been a long period of kind of dysfunctional unhappiness. Willie Lincoln ends up there, and not by my design, but the book made it such that everybody started leaning into this kid a little bit. He's described as Lincoln's favorite son, and apparently a really winning young kid. So the ghost started loving him, and helping him. And so in that moment, that cacophonous democracy, which, as we know, can go bad when nobody's listening, and goodwill can vanish. In that book, the goodwill got built up by their mutual interest in this kid, and they actually started listening to each other towards the end of the book. So that was just one of those surprises that happens in fiction. But I think it pertains, that we, in fiction, it's based on such a beautiful idea, a simple idea, which all of you know because you're here. We can understand one another, and it's natural to be curious about one another. And so if the political tone is such that I don't want to understand you and I'm not curious about you, get thee behind me, fiction can serve as an antidote to remind us that actually other people are interesting, and they're on a continuum with us. And I think that kind of the book sort of reminded me of that as I was writing it, which was a kind of a side benefit.
Yeah. Well, in the publishing world, for several years now, there's been somewhat of a debate about whether, reading fiction actually does make you more empathetic. Originally there was a study, I think, that came out that, psychologists or anthropologists or sociologists did a study that, like, people who read fiction are more empathetic. And then there was a sort of backlash to that argument. Where do you stand in that?
I agree with both sides because I'm so empathetic. No, I teach writing, and I have a Substack called Story Club, so we do a lot of analysis of stories. And the one thing I know kind of as a former scientist is that, okay, when you're writing a story, just if your goal is to keep the reader reading, if that's your goal, which I think it should be, you'll find that you're inevitably led down a certain path. That's a path of greater specificity, tighter, more compelling language. But let's just stop with those two. If I say, once there was this guy, nobody wants to read that book. Once there was a very tall man, whose back always hurt. And he had one great love in his life, was that he was a model train enthusiast. Suddenly, I kind of like that guy. Oh, how does he bend down to work on the trains? You know, his back hurts, poor guy. So just by, I got to write this down. But you know, just by applying specificity, I think it interests readers more. Somehow our brains work that way. You hear the car, you hear the dented red car. The second one comes alive more in the mind. So specificity, and then I can't remember the second. So when you're more specific, the reader feels engaged and respected. You know, if I feel, if I say in my book, God forbid, the cat jumped onto the black table, the plainer ebony surface, the dark-hued flat space. Somewhere in that, you're like, hey, George, I've got other things I could be doing, you know. So my model is you've got a inner reading experience. We've got an intimate communication going. My responsibility as the writer is to respect you, you know, to say, oh, this person's not any dumber than me. They've traveled, they've loved, they've lost. So let's talk to this person on a high level. That's called revision. So all of those things, I think, tends to make the writer, it lures out empathy on the part of the writer. You know, when I'm writing a character, if I just write a caricature of that person, it's not going to be interesting. If I lean in and day after day keep asking the character, well, who are you really? Do you have any redeeming qualities? That's me practicing empathy. And I would say some version of the same thing goes on in the reader's mind, led by the writer. So I think it does increase empathy. You know, I think it does. Yeah.
So how did Oak Hill Cemetery, the actual place here, serve as inspiration? I mean, did you go there and tour it? And
Right. Well, what happened was many years ago, back, I think it was when Clinton was president, we were here visiting my wife's cousin, and we drove by on the Parkway. And she just offhandedly said, oh yeah, up there, you can't really see it, but up there is where Willie Lincoln's son was buried. And I was, you know, Lincoln had kids? Oh, yeah. And then, and I researched it, and sure enough, there were these accounts that said that Lincoln, his son was in a buried crypt, or a borrowed crypt up there, and he had apparently gone there on at least one occasion. Lincoln had. This was the lore. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. But at that time, I'm mostly a funny kind of contemporary issues writer, and I just couldn't see any intersection between my sensibility and that very kind of theatrical material. So I left it alone for a long time. Then many years later, we were here visiting again, and we went there, and I just wanted to see the Carroll Mausoleum. And I was kind of really, in retrospect, deciding whether to try it or not. I thought, I'm going to get in trouble. It's going to be cheesy. I better not do it. And then we went out there, and we couldn't find it. We couldn't find the tomb, and we were about to leave. And then my wife's cousin just happened to find it and came running back and said, it's over here. So we went over there, and I just stood there for a couple of minutes, and something said to me, look, if you can't write this, and if you don't try it, then you have to stop saying you're a writer. You know, it's such a beautiful, profound story. And if your excuse is, I don't have the depth to do it, just quit, you know. I mean, you know, I could just see my own gravestone, you know, never tried the thing he most wanted to, you know. So that was kind of beautiful, because I just being in that physical place, and then later at the chapel to think, wow, Lincoln walked through this doorway. He really did. We know that for sure. It gave me the courage to say, well, surely there's a story here. Now, you might not be the person for it, but you're going to regret it if you don't give it a try. So after that, I went home, and I kind of gave myself like a 6-month contract. Like, first, don't tell anybody you're doing this. Do it in private, and at the end of 6 months, you can evaluate. And that was kind of liberating to just say, you know, I've waited 6 months before on my model train set. No. So, you know, so it was real kind of a permission giving, and that visit was kind of pivotal in that.
Was there any trepidation, you know, as a person who receives a lot of submissions for the book festival and the other events we do, there are so many books published about Lincoln, so many, and I wonder if if you ever had trepidation as
Yes.
a novelist, like how he's so sort of calcified in a way.
Yeah.
He's been written about so much. Were you scared about trying to
100%.
figure out
I mean, he's on South Park. He's in car commercials. But I think what I tell my students is, every project has a problem. Any book you ever start to write, it's got a problem. You'll find out in the first couple weeks what it is. Amateurs go, oh, I can't write a book with a problem in it. But people who are committed to it go, the problem absolutely will contain an opportunity. Because the reader feels the problem too. The reader goes, Lincoln, oh, whoa, this guy's going off the deep end. But then you're in that intimate conversation where he's saying, George, you're going to write about Lincoln. I'm like, yeah. All right. And then we're in communication. And he's looking for the place where my inept handling of Lincoln causes him to shut it and go play a video game. If I can anticipate those moments, I can get around them. And that actually is writing, So for me to say, I had a period where I went, look, just list everything about this book that's dangerous. It was Lincoln. It was the Civil War. It was race was quite a problematic thing. All these different things, mostly Lincoln, really. Is it going to be like, does a reader go, oh, nice top hat? No. But once you say this is a potential problem, it's like a relationship. If you say, oh boy, that person has this defect, that doesn't mean you couldn't love them. But at some point, you're going to have to admit it and work with it. So for me, that was every day. It was like, is it cheesy yet? Is it? Yeah. And so that's, I think, a part of the process. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you just mentioned your students. You teach at Syracuse. We think about fashion trends. There are trends in food. But there are also trends in ideas, and I wonder if you see trends in your students' work that they hand in.
Yes.
What do you do when that happens?
Yeah, we had, I don't do this anymore, but at Syracuse, we get about 700 applications a year for 6 spots.
Oh, wow.
So there's a period in January, February where we're reading all these manuscripts and deciding, and it's a lot of work, but it's kind of wonderful because you do see what are the trends of the moment. There was one time after 9/11, weirdly, we got a clustering of maybe 8 or 9 stories that were all, and this is weird, all about burn victims who then go on a long sea journey. And I've never been, of course, but I've never been able to figure out if there's a precedent, but they all came in the year after 9/11.
It was one person who was applying 7 times.
Yeah, right. With the variations on the ship, yeah. Yeah, the ship name was always different. But yeah, so you do see that. I think it's totally inevitable that there'd be something in the air. Mostly, I think what we try to do is we have the opportunity to work so closely with those students. There's only, like I'm teaching in the fall, there'll only be 6 students in the class. And we'll do 3 stories by each person during the semester. And we're doing, I'm doing close line edits and conferences. So I think what tends to happen is if there's a trend that one feels as a trend, then you hope the person will get off it. Because if we already feel it as a trend, it's probably past date, past due date. So, but like everything in critiquing fiction, for me, you don't necessarily have to say that. You just get in, do your work on the line level, and slowly the thing will move away from the trend. I remember once I had a student who was a really wonderful writer, but you could just feel the David Foster Wallace, in every, and he said, I love him. And his classmates said, don't imitate him. I'm not. And he kind of was. So I knew this was coming, and I thought about it, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to ever mention David's name. I'm just going to line edit. And David was such an incredibly pyrotechnical but also precise writer. And this person was less precise, and so in the places where he was really getting David-y, there were often errors. So it took a lot of work, but you could say this sentence doesn't cohere, the verb and subject don't agree, and taking it apart that way, never mentioning David's name, then he put it back together in a more authentic, correct way, and suddenly there he was on the page. So that's kind of what we commit to at that level of student. It can't just be, don't be trendy, but you have to show them line to line where the thing has gone off. And
Yeah.
It's deep work. beautiful work.
So I mean, you're close line editing, and that's part of the writing process. What is your writing process? I mean, do you write a certain time every day, or?
I theoretically, but not, sometimes not. So I have after all these years, if you sit, like last night I was in the hotel, and I'm like, you know what, got 2 hours, let's just try something, you know. So something kind of clicks on. But for me, it's really just printing out the thing that I'm working on, trying as best I can to have kind of a neutral feeling about it. Like, you know, don't love any of it, don't hate it, just read it. And then, you know, sometimes if you work on something long enough, you love everything. It's perfect. The coffee stain, I want it right there, you know. But the trick is to kind of like almost meditatively go, okay, I'm just picking this thing off the seat of a bus. I'm just reading it fresh. Then, over the years, the one skill I think I've developed is I can get into that mindset pretty quickly of neutrality. And then as I'm reading, I can just feel this little meter, I always say it's like a meter, or P for positive reaction, N for negative. And as I'm reading, I can just feel it, you know. Sometimes it's the smallest little phrase or something. And then I just indulge that feeling and take it out or add something. Go through the whole document with that kind of loose but tight feeling. Would I like this if I was reading it for the first time? Then I put those changes in, print it out again, and do that 2 or 3 times a day. That's it. Yeah. So it's kind of a weird thing because you make somewhat of a life around it, but it's really, you know, as so many things in life are, it's actually about trying to get rid of your projections about the moment you're in, then reacting honestly to the thing in front of you, and reacting accordingly. That's it. You know, not a lot of big intellectual thoughts or anything like that. Just like, what do I think of this in the moment?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I mean, this feeling as a fiction writer, being sort of in the middle and not convincing yourself that you love the story too much. Because Beverly Gage, who you know, is here at the festival today, she wrote this biography of J. Edgar Hoover, and it won the Pulitzer for biography in May. She talks about not really, you know, she spent 12 years on the book, and she finished it not really admiring Hoover. Yeah. True confessions. So, you know, and at first I thought, well, that's a really weird place to spend 12 years of your life, not really admiring the man that you're writing about, but it's actually the perfect space for a biographer to be in, because if you love the person too much or hate them so much, it's really going to show in the pages. So, anyway, it's just interesting.
No, it is, because we've been talking in Story Club, the Substack I do, about specificity, and about how if you, as a critic, a reader, you try to identify exactly where a book went bad for you, or a story, or where there was racism or misogyny or wherever, homophobia, whatever, wherever you start to turn against the book, if you can be a good enough reader to identify precisely where, then what happens is, as you look at that technically, it slowly transforms from a moral failing to a technical issue, you know, in most cases. Of course, we do that. I do that with my students. If somebody writes a sexist story, everybody reacts to it. We want to show exactly where that happened. Often, the sexist thing will seem to be a structural problem. So there's a famous Gogol story called Nevsky Prospect. And I was teaching it because it's kind of weirdly amazing, a total train wreck, but like by a genius. Train wreck by a genius, that's a good movie title. But so one of my students said, I don't want to read it, it's sexist. I said, okay, where? And she was a wonderful reader, and she said, I'll tell you where. And she showed me that there was a place where a male character had been humiliated, and he had a nice monologue, an interior monologue after that. A few pages later, a female character is humiliated, and the narrator makes a joke at her expense. I mean, that was just science. It's right there. So that gave us a chance to kind of not cancel Gogol, but just to say, interesting, would it be a better story if Gogol had been able to observe parallelism in those, you know, give the woman it could be a funny moment, but give her a moment. There was that kind of feeling in the classroom that sometimes happens where it's just like a silent, like, aha, that would be a better story, you know. So this close reading, I'm sure when Beverly was researching Hoover, she can tell you precisely why she doesn't like him, you know, exactly when in his life he lost her. That, I think having that reaction to the text is really empowering for the person. You know, if I read a text and it's got a bias against balding middle-aged guys, and my feelings are hurt, and I go, yeah, that's not powerful. You know, anger isn't actually that powerful of an emotion. If I can go into the text and go, he actually doesn't hate balding middle-aged men. He just has a problem with dialogue, you know, and we fix it. Suddenly, I feel like I've taken ownership of the text. So to kind of go back to your early question about democracy, in so many things we're struggling with right now, we've got superficial engagement, we've got a predisposition to one side or the other, we've got no time to dwell in a text, and so we come out agitated and we feel more alone, I would say, you know. With literature, as you know, you get to live in Ivan Illich's mind for 75 pages as the guy dies. Mm-hmm. And if you don't love that guy when you're done, there's something wrong with you. You might not like him, but you've become him briefly. Mm-hmm. How could you not love him? So I think this, in fiction, I think in some ways our culture, this is a vague thing to think, but I feel like we went off base a bit when we started treating literary fiction as a kind of an interesting side gig, you know, something that some English nerds do. The scientists are telling us that fiction is actually the essential thing that the brain does in every instant, including this one. I read one account that said when you walk into a room like this, the back of your brain makes a rough draft. It says, auditorium, I think. Then you're looking around and you go, oh, it's got a balcony. It starts to process the individual things. That actually happens from the back of the brain to the front. It's actually revising that in every millisecond, you know. So the idea that we live in a world that is really beyond our grasp, actually. We don't like to think it is, but our minds are too small to really grasp it. We were designed that way. And the first symptom of that is me, my jacket, my award. Aha. You know, and what we know is that actually the distinction of me and the world is artificial, you know. So fiction does something just to remind us in the tiniest way that the real big truths of the world evade us mostly, except maybe in moments of love, tragedy, crisis. Fiction can be a way of sort of, in the safety of our home, recreating such moments so that we remember that we have a greater ability to empathize with other people, even our enemies, than we thought we did. Even Hoover, you know.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, you know, we're preaching to the choir here, a room full of book lovers, but I mean, this is why we call it the National Book Festival. You know, there's something about spending that devoted amount of time with the length of a book, where you are not tweeting and, you know, swiping and doing everything else, and that's the concern is, you know, how much nowadays are Americans actually sitting down with a book, whether it's an e-book or, you know, a physical book. That doesn't matter, I don't think. But
I've had this experience when I first got an iPhone. I was on it way too much, and then I went to teach my Russian class these stories that I adore, you know, and they weren't working. They were just somehow they weren't getting through, and they weren't becoming sensory experiences anymore. And they weren't. Sometimes, you know, when you read a beautiful work of fiction, it's complicated. You're reading about Russia in the 19th century, but somehow your childhood neighborhood springs up, or you know, some weird, beautiful things. That wasn't happening, which really scared me. So I've noticed that if I restrict screen time, whatever the gland is that helps you read in 3 dimensions comes alive again, which is a little scary when you think about the way I would suppose most of our habits have changed over the last 10 or 15 years, you know.
yeah.
But I can literally, I don't know if you've had that experience, but I can feel if I lay off the screens, the texts start coming alive again. Mm-hmm. And also when I'm editing on the screen is a terrible idea, I find. The page, the optics of the physical page help me hear the language better. Mm-hmm. So these are things I think I'm thinking about them a lot because even though I'm going to live to be 140, I don't have that much time left, and I want to make sure I'm reading well during those.
Yeah, you're 139 right
now.
Yeah. Okay, last question for me. So start thinking about your questions, and we've got some microphones here in both aisles. So line up if you would like to. You and I both have roots in Amarillo, Texas. And I am just curious if, for you, having lived on the plains, do you think that that has affected you in any way? I asked the question because I, live here in a busy city, and I used to live in New York, and it feels very different than Amarillo. But it's not even so much that it's a smaller city in these bigger cities. It's more that the plains, I think, once you leave Amarillo and you drive out into the Panhandle, you really get a very vast sense of how small you are in the universe.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had that feeling as well.
Yes, I was raised in Chicago. My mother's family is from Amarillo, so every summer we'd go back there. And I had this kind of, I was a Chicago person with this voice, but also in my heart I was a Texan, and so I would always come back from that with a slight fake accent, but for me it actually was a very important place because I was there. I worked in the oil fields in Asia and came home and had no money at all in Amarillo and was working at Iowa Beef Slaughterhouse for a while, and so it was the first time that having come from Asia, I just saw America new. It was new. It was all it felt so crazy at that time. I remember coming back from Singapore, and in the Westgate Mall, they had one of those little candy kiosks, which was new. And I was just like, it was almost like being on acid, like, oh my God, what's with all this candy? And, so I was really the first time that I'd seen my country apart from my habituation. And it was giddy, it was beautiful, and also, of course, then you start thinking about class and capitalism and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and the Cadillac Ranch.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start over here, and then we'll go over there.
Hi,
Hi.
just wanted to say first I love Lincoln in the Bardo
Thank you.
and was very moved by it. But one of your works that I was most moved by was actually the commencement speech that you gave that was turned into a book. Congratulations, by the way. And so moved by it, in fact, that for a while I had a Post-it note on my door that said, what I regret most is failures of kindness, to remind myself to be good to people as I walked out the door each day. I would just love anything you can share about what inspired that and how you wrote it, anything you would love to share.
Did that work for you?
No,
'cause
yeah. I mean, it was a good reminder, yes, because I'm prone to, especially living in this city, you get grumpy very quickly.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. That's so
Yeah.
nice to hear. Yeah, no, I had my youngest daughter. Her principal asked me to give the middle school commencement speech years ago. So I thought, what do I know? So I thought, well, the one thing I know is that at that age, at 50 at that point or whatever, I have made so many mistakes. I don't have any advice except I remembered one time when I was in 3rd grade and there was a girl who came to school, was really struggling with, not exactly bullying, but kind of bullying. And I just didn't do anything. I didn't join in, but I didn't do anything. And I thought, that's actually a regret. I have that regret. So I wrote the speech for my daughter's class, and then about 7 years later, Syracuse asked if I would give a speech at graduation, and I said, yeah, I've got one. and so and then, being an idiot, I didn't look for it. And about 3 days before, I realized it was lost. I didn't have it. So I kind of rewrote it from scratch, but the same basic idea. And it was an interesting moment to kind of say, I'm at a college graduation. I should say something profound. The most profound thing I know is simple. It's something I'm still failing at, which is the basic idea of in a given situation, are we capable of knowing what would benefit the people in a 15-foot radius, And I made the speech and it went viral and I started talking about it. And then I realized that this idea of kindness is kind of a gateway because it's not just being nice, Somebody drives a stick through your head and you're like, oh, thank you for the coat rack, There's a deeper element, and every spiritual tradition really is about kindness, but kindness at speed. You go into a coffee shop and you see the barista's been crying. Good. You want to be kind. Do you shut up? Do you engage? And that leads you to say, well, actually, it would depend on the situation, the specifics. It would depend on awareness, So I'm still working on it, but I'm glad to hear that you liked it. And but also, I'm now against kindness. I've disavowed it, and I think you should.
Your next book is titled Against
Bullying, the high road.
Thank you. This is somewhat related, but one of my other authors that I like, she talks about how she's duty-bound to provide hope. And I wondered if you would comment on that, and I just get the feeling that I don't know, I get that feeling like you do that too, but I don't know.
With hope? Hope?
Yeah, feeling in your books there, I don't know if,
Like sort of-
if it just happens or if you are intentional about providing hope.
Yeah.
Like she talked about feeling duty bound.
Right. I think hope, for me, it comes kind of naturally in the composition process, only because if I say this person had a bad day, and then she got a terrible disease, and she got hit by a car, there's no interest in it for you because, like, okay, well, that's pretty bad, you know. And the implicit question in any story is, oh, all right, things can be bad. We all know that. We know that. What do we have to respond with? That, for me, that's the way that stories are always talking. So you can't underestimate the extent to which things can be bad. That's false. You also can't pretend that we're, as Tilly Olsen says, helpless like the shirt on the iron, or however she said it. You know, we do have things we can do within ourselves for each other. So I think the perfect story is one in which those two things are kind of dancing a little bit. For me, because I'm from Chicago, the South Side, the cynicism is easy, you know. I mean, my mind just tends that way. So for me, the writing practice has been, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, you know, the baby fell off the cliff. What else you got? Oh, there's a flying horse, you know, who can. So that, I mean, I think with each person, if the job is to balance those two, you kind of find out what your preset is, you know, and then revising helps you work up the thing that maybe you're deficient in, you know, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Over here.
Hi.
Hi.
Could you talk a little bit more about how you subvert expectations and narratives?
Yes, you're a writer, I bet.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a great writerly question. I think the trick is to know what the reader might be expecting. That goes back to what I said earlier. You're looking at your own text as if you hadn't seen it before. You kind of put aside your agenda and your aspirations. Just go, okay, some decent person out there is reading my text. Where is she right now? You know, to what impasse have I led her? And then you react right out of that. You know, so that way you're not presuming there's a certain expectation. You're feeling it yourself as a co-reader a little bit. So I think it's a little bit like I don't know if you were a class clown when you were a kid. Were you a joke maker in class?
I was a teacher's pet.
Oh, that's good. That's even better. Well, yeah. So what I noticed was when you are in a situation even like this. I'm trying to know where you guys are to get a laugh, maybe, you know, and so that's our skill as writers. Where would a good intentioned, decent reader be at this point in my narrative? And then the really cool assumption is she'd be where you are as you reread your own work. And then for me, it feels like what you do is you respond in that instant in a spontaneous way, and then of course the reader's going to feel seen, something like that, you know. So I think the trick for me in so many things is try not to overthink it, but trust that you are a natural entertainer, as we all are. We all have learned to engage with other people in our own flavor. So it's that thing of trusting yourself as a reader of your own text, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Good luck with your work.
Okay. Over here.
Hi. So in A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, you talk a lot about how causality works to engage readers. I think in a number of interviews I've heard you mention how efficiency is the name of the game. So in my own MFA, I learned that novels require the injection of space and breathing room. So I wanted to ask, how do you navigate the push and pull of creating that efficiency and engaging readers while injecting breathing space?
Another great question. The one answer is I only wrote one novel, and I'm not sure it's a novel. My wife is doubtful. She's like, there's a lot of white space in that thing. But no, it's a great question, and it relates to the last one. First of all, I think what we're trying to do as writers is answer your question on our feet, and recognizing that for every single person, that answer is going to be different. It's certainly true that efficiency rules. It's also true that if you only think about efficiency, you're not going to make any breathing space, right? So I think the trick is, as in the case in so many writing questions, you have to kind of say, remember that Chevy Chase had that thing where there's two women fighting kind of housewives fighting, and he goes, "Hold it, you two, you're both right. It's a dessert topping and a floor wax." So anytime we come up with a valid writing question, we have to say, oh yeah, I'm going to have to figure out for myself where I am on that continuum, right? That's really, I mean, it sounds like an evasive answer, but I think you have to say, yes, I want to be efficient, and yes, I want to give the reader a pleasant ride with some room. Now, how can I, in particular, do that with my text, you know, if that makes sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Okay.
Hello. I read many of your stories in college classes.
Sorry.
And no, no, it's great. But one that stood out to me specifically was Eliot Spencer, which I read for a linguistics course. And I think there's an unfolding of language and like a layering going on in a lot of your work. So I just was wondering if you could talk about how you construct these like realizations through language.
You're a great reader. Thank you for that. Yes. I think part of, okay, so we're talking about in a work of fiction, I think one model is kind of like those little toys, cars, you wind them up, put them on the floor, and it goes under the couch really fast. So it's a model of continuous escalation. I like it. Not everybody does. But I think for all works of fiction, there's some expectation that we're not just going to tread water for 20 pages. So escalation, we always think it's plot. Of course it is. Romeo and Juliet get in worse and worse trouble. But it can also happen through a change in the language. So like in that story, Elliot Smith, a guy is basically has all of his language function wiped clean, and he spends a whole story reacquiring it. So that's one of the kind of little Bunsen burners that's lit under the story. So my idea is if I'm trying to discover his language as I'm going along, which means that the language doesn't stay static, and then the assumption is you're going to feel it on the other end as escalation. And in that story, what happened was as he came back to himself, he became more articulate, more feeling, and he started to remember who he had been before the brainwashing, which then in turn became plot. So yeah, 100%. But the whole thing with the story for me is it's not, we tend to break it into component bits, but the way I see it is you're on the other end, you're in a certain relation with me, and every single thing in that story changes that relationship, including the language, you know, including actually the typography. In that story, those spaces between sentences. So that's kind of fun to think that we can create a pattern intuitively, and you, who I never met, is on the other end of it receiving it perfectly. That's empathy. That's cool, you know, so thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we've got time, I think, for one more quick
A
question.
few minutes ago, you mentioned Story Club, which is kind of an online chat group on writing, which you started. It's been wonderful for me, but I'm wondering, it must be a lot of work for you. I wonder how that's been.
How many people are in Story Club, just to be self-promoting a little bit? Yeah, there could be more. You know, but no, I started this, Substack approached me and asked if I would try it, and I had just published that Russian book, and I thought, all right, maybe I could do that. And it's been so much fun, and I started out begrudging the work, and because that community is so positive, somebody called us the most positive place on the internet at one point, so I'm finding that I'm doing the extra work very happily, and it seems to be, I think, helping my writing also, because now I've got 2 opportunities a week to do something where I really have to, in order to not disrespect you guys, I have to really engage with the story. So far it's been really amazing, you know, and yeah, I love it. Yeah. Thank you, and thanks for being part of it.
Okay, so people who didn't get their questions answered, remember George is going to his signing right now in halls D and E on the expo floor, so follow him there. Congratulations
Thank you, sir.
on the award, and thank you so much for...
Thank you all for being here.